Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Hax. I make this video to correspond with a twit longer that I posted the other night. The twit longer that I posted included my recommendations for resolving the Melee community's ongoing controller legality issues. What I basically want to do within this video is explain to people what the end game of creating parity between the Gamecube controller archetype and box archetype looks like. It's been my goal to fix this for the community, get this all sorted out ever from the get-go, ever since I wrote the box manifesto. I was very peculiar about every detail, making sure that there's full parity between the two controller types and that the rule set makes sense so that there can be a legal controller for people with accessibility issues, while also maintaining parity and competitive fairness with the primary controller archetype, that being the GameCube controller. So going forward, there are a few pointers that absolutely must be known with regards to GameCube controller hardware, software, recommended technique, etc. Things that you will want to know if you're using this type of controller. Also things that the community in general should know in terms of formulating the final rule set. So I'm making a video to basically go over what those key pointers are. And so without further ado, I will jump straight into my first recommendation. So the first recommendation of mine is to purchase one of the new motherboards known as a Phob motherboard. The controller that I'm holding in my hand is indeed a Phob, and I'm going to explain what the most valuable feature on the Phob is, in my opinion. Now, the Phob has tons and tons of great features that make it better than the default GameCube controller motherboard, but the one that stands out to me the most, just give me a moment, is the fact that the Phob's analog stick and C-stick use a Hall effect sensor, meaning the potentiometers on this controller are magnetic as opposed to using a traditional potentiometer mechanism. That is notable because, believe it or not, on the original GameCube controller motherboard, which uses cheap potentiometers, the GameCube controller can accumulate something called P.O.D.E, which is suspected to be physical degradation. I don't know if this was ever determined for certain, but regardless, the effect that P.O.D.E causes over time is that your controller will begin to behave in wacky ways. And in order to fix that, you have to do things like unclip and reclip these potentiometers, stuff like that you shouldn't have to worry about as a competitor. And so the Phob is really the first motherboard that is actually made for competitive Melee players. The fact that this potentiometer will remain consistent and responsive as time goes on is reason enough that everyone should be using one of these controllers. And of course, that is also essential in reaching parity between the GameCube controller and box, because naturally the box doesn't suffer from any type of analog stick or C-stick reading issue of that nature. So that's my first recommendation in terms of increasing the GameCube controller's performance. Everything in this video is generally going to involve increasing the GameCube controller's performance because that's all that there really is left. The box has been nerfed as much as possible for many years now, and so we'll continue down the list of recommendations that involve improving GameCube controller. Now, the second recommendation is to use a Z-jump layout with the mouse click Z modification. So this is where the recommendations start to fall under technique, meaning there is the onus on GameCube controller users to use their controller properly or in better ways per se, whereas on the box this would be automated for you. On the GameCube controller, Z-Jump is absolutely the best layout. As you can see, this controller has been modified. It has the mouse click Z modification, which is very important because it bypasses the fact that the Z button would normally have a really cheaply made lever underneath it. The Z button is basically the worst button, hardware-wise, on the stock GameCube controller, and that is an incredibly important thing to fix on the Z-Jump layout because Z becomes one of the most, well, pretty much the most important button on that layout. And so you need better hardware in order to make the most of your GameCube controller at that point. Now, Z-Jump can be activated either through the Phob itself or through 1.03, which is a software mod that I'm going to get to in a moment. But it is absolutely the layout that should be used as the standard going forward. It's pretty much a massive game design oversight that Z-Jump wasn't what the game devs gave Melee from the get-go, but now people are realizing that it's pretty much a necessity in order to make the most of the GameCube controller's hardware and, of course, to achieve parity with the box. So the mouse-click Z modification is going to be, in my opinion, the most important hardware mod going forward. Now, for my third recommendation, this one also pertains to making the most of the GameCube controller's hardware. But what's interesting about this recommendation is that you'll need a software mod in order to achieve it. That software mod is 1.03, Tournament Edition is my recommendation. This mod is going to be absolutely needed going forward. Basically, this, Phob, and mouse-click Z are the three things that will be necessary in order to achieve parity between the GameCube controller and box. For those who've seen my other 1.03 videos, it's now up to 11 mechanics being fixed on the 1.03 controller fix, which is the fully fixed version of Melee, basically. Believe it or not, there are 11 dysfunctional mechanics in this game. UCF's only fixing 2.5 of them. 1.03 fixes all 11. So it makes for the best version of Melee yet, but in my opinion, the most significant fix on all of 1.03 is the ADT shield fix. ADT shield is a mechanic which normally makes it so that your shield button, the trigger that you use to shield as the primary shield trigger, absolutely must not have a spring on it. On vanilla, you have to bypass ADT by removing your spring. But with ADT Shield as a software fix, which is listed on the manual that's on the screen right now, which I know can't really be seen, but regardless, what the ADT fix lets you achieve is you can now shield with a trigger that has a spring in it. So the reason that's significant is because if you're holding the controller with the traditional grip, meaning 3 fingers on the back of each handle, and then your index finger, one index finger on each shoulder trigger area, and then the thumb on the front faceplates, the thumbs on the front faceplate, then you need to use your right index finger for Z-Jump, at which point, ideally, your left index finger is able to use the L button for shield, as well as light shield and analog L cancel. That is only possible with the ADT shield fix. So I'll show you what this looks like. Let me just toggle my Z-Jump on real fast. Okay, so I've got Z-Jump on now. The way you play with the ideal layout, the ideal 1.03 layout, is you're Z-Jumping, and then everything shield and L cancel related is done with L. That was never possible before. You can use a traditional grip to achieve all of that now, thanks to the ADT shield fix. And something else that's significant about that is that you can use L to perform analog L cancels. L becomes your designated button for analog L canceling, which is the only method that you should ever use to L cancel. The box is designed with this in mind. The Z button on the box is intended to be used as the L cancel button, so box players actually have the luxury of having that automated. GameCube controller users, on the other hand, you see, there are a couple things that you still need to know in terms of making the most of your GameCube controller. It won't be automated for you, but the recommended technique that needs to be known far and wide is to use Z-Jump with the 1.03 modded ADT shield. And so that L button is able to do everything for you, and you can hold the controller with a traditional grip like so, and it gets it all done. So that's the best GameCube controller layout yet. On this layout, I would only ever touch R for wave dash. I did remove the spring in R. This R button does not have a spring because that makes wave dashing feel better, so I prefer that, but that's optional. What you'll always want to do is keep the spring in L and use that software mod to your advantage. I think the ADT Shield mod is the most important mod, the most important newly added mod on 1.03 for the reasons I just went over. So those are my top 3 tips for how the Melee community should resolve its controller legality issues going forward with regards to GameCube controller and box parity. But one other subject I wanted to cover is the fact that while we're at it, we should probably address notched GameCube controllers. You see, there are basically 2 controller archetypes at minimum, I should say. There is the GameCube controller with mods I just went over, meaning the Phob motherboard, mouse click Z, and the 1.03 software fix, as well as the L button with the spring in it that has the ADT immunity. That's the end game GameCube controller that we need. But now, what we don't need is for notches to be legal. I'll say it outright. Notches, basically what they do is they create a third archetype which doesn't need to exist. They kind of got forced in a couple of years ago. They got mass distributed to all the top players, and so they became the standard. But really, all notches are doing is creating a separate controller archetype, which costs a ton of money. It's ratchet. You know, notches have all this deviation to them and all these other logistical issues that they create. And so while we're at finalizing the controller rule set, I would personally go ahead and ban notches. Because when I designed the box, its angling capabilities were explicitly designed around a notchless GameCube controller. Obviously, people would hate the box even more if it was based around a notched GameCube controller, so I wasn't going to do that. But now, after all of this is resolved, after the steps in this video are followed, notches will be basically the biggest controller-related problem remaining, and so I'd go ahead and phase those out while we're at it. So, in closing, that rounds out my recommended endgame rule set, as well as recommended technique, hardware mods, software mods, etc. And I think that lands balance between the GameCube controller and box in a pretty good spot. I think the endgame that we're looking at is these 2 controllers definitely still have advantages and disadvantages over each other, but it's pretty well-rounded once all of those steps are followed. I think the GameCube controller is easily better at everything angling related. Anything pertaining to wave dashing or up being, I would definitely choose the GameCube controller over the box because the box's nerfs definitely keep its angling within reason. But the box has a better dash dance. I don't think that can ever be. I don't think that can ever be taken away from it, just because the digital left right is better than an analog stick at alternating rapidly and being more precise. It's very possible that the box is still the better controller. I think right now, before 1.03, meaning without 1.03 as the standard, box is undeniably the better controller. But I think even after all of this, it's still very much so possible that the box is the better controller. I mean, one controller has to be better than the other at the end of the day. They are not the same thing. But our goal is to keep it within reason because we need the box to be legal for accessibility reasons. And then, of course, we need to keep the GameCube controller viable because it's probably always going to be the most popular archetype. But what we don't need is for there to be a separate archetype called the notched GameCube controller. That can actually be completely phased out. So those are my closing thoughts. I've attached some resources to the video description that I recommend checking out. Those being the final 1.03 controller fix recap, the Twitlonger that I posted the other night, which basically recaps a lot of this information in written form. And then I included the video from early last year, which explains why analog L canceling is the only way you should ever L cancel. I recommend checking that one out. It's a little long though, so basically I'll just tell you that analog L canceling is better because it gives you better L cancel windows as well as better tech windows. So what that means is that when you're using the GameCube controller that I showed you, always L cancel by soft pressing L. Only ever soft press L to L cancel. It's not really as well known as it should be, but that's something that you'll need to know about using this controller. It's automated on box because the Z button's right here, but on this controller you'll still need to know to go ahead and do that. So those are my closing thoughts. That's my endgame controller rule set. I think it'd be in the Melee community's best interest to implement all of this before the end of the year so that 2023 can have everything fleshed out from the get-go. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of Melee content. So thanks so much for tuning into the video. Have a good one.